June 5, 1945. A sandpit in Braunschweig, Germany. 16-year-old Heinz Petry stands against a wooden stake. He is not wearing a uniform. He wears oversized civilian clothes. His breathing is heavy, jagged, audible in the morning silence. American military police step into position. The boy's hands are bound tight behind his back. A white cloth is pulled over his eyes. Everything goes dark. Across the pit, 17-year-old Josef Schöner waits. He is next. In the United States, 16-year-olds were just earning the right to drive. In Braunschweig, they were facing a firing squad for espionage. The Americans racked the slides of their rifles. A sharp metallic sound. 10 men aiming at a child. This was the end of a process that began 12 years earlier. A system that turned play into drill and children into weapons. Heinz and Josef were not the first. They would not be the last. The officer gives the command. A synchronized roar of Springfield rifles. The ropes held the bodies upright for a second before they slumped. But 12 years before the firing squads in Braunschweig, these children had a different choice, or rather, the illusion of one. In 1933, the Hitler Youth was a fringe group of 50,000 members. By December of that same year, the number exploded to over 2 million. This wasn't a trend. It was a hostile takeover of an entire generation. 2 million children. That is more than the entire population of Latvia at the time. How do you turn a nation of thinkers into a nation of soldiers? Start before they can read. The mechanism was simple and brutal. Hitler didn't compete for the hearts of the youth. He liquidated the competition. One by one, every alternative vanished. The Boy Scouts were declared illegal. Church youth groups were forcibly disbanded. Secret police arrested members of communist youth clubs. The contrast was absolute. Yesterday, a boy could choose his path. Today, the state owned every Saturday afternoon. There were no more scouts, no more Paris hikers, no more independent clubs. If you were a German boy between 10 and 18, the world shrank to a single brown shirt. This wasn't a club, it was a hostage situation. To stay out was to label your family as enemies of the state. Refusal meant becoming a social outcast in your own classroom. In 1936, a 13-year-old boy saw no politics. He saw campfires and tents. The Hitler Youth did not feel like a trap. It felt like an adventure. The state offered a simple trade. Join the ranks or watch the world move on without you. Friends gathered every weekend for marches and survival drills. They wore sharp uniforms. They handled weapons and threw practice grenades. To a teenager, this was not mobilization. It was a club. What remained hidden was the programming. Hatred was taught with the cold precision of mathematics. Songs did not celebrate life. They glorified the beauty of dying for the leader. How do you turn a thinker into a fanatic? You start before they can weigh the cost. Franz Jagemann later recalled the psychological weight of those days. The slogan was simple: Germany must live, even if every boy in the ranks had to die. This was not education. It was a reconstruction of the human soul. Jagemann described it as a hammer driving a nail through wood. The ideology was struck again and again until it was buried deep enough that it could never be removed. General Erwin Rommel arrived at the Hitler youth camps in 1937. He did not come for hikes or songs. He came to inspect the future of the Wehrmacht. Rommel pressured leadership to drop the scouting games. He demanded a junior army. 1.5 million boys received marksman training by 1938. It was no longer a hobby. It was a factory for killers. A dedicated rifle school turned teenagers into ballistics experts. 51,000 boys earned their sniper badges before the war even began. To visualize the scale, that is 5 full infantry divisions of elite shooters. They handled Mauser rifles better than most adult conscripts. The youngest marksmen were 10 years old. September 1st, 1939. The games ended. Poland was invaded and the world went to war. The Hitler Youth ceased being a club, it became a reservoir. At first, the boys were messengers. They ran through the rubble of air raids. They guided civilians to shelters. They were useful auxiliaries. But as the war ground on, the German casualty lists grew longer. The state stopped seeing children. It saw gaps in the front line. By 1942, the defense strengthening camps appeared. These were not for scouts. These were for infantry. Boys aged 16 to 18 traded wooden staves for machine guns and grenades. They practiced with pistols until the recoil felt natural. Then came 1943, the turning point. Stalingrad became a graveyard. 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the ruins. To visualize the scale, the losses exceeded the entire population of Bonn. The Eastern Front was a vacuum, sucking in divisions and spitting out corpses. How to replace 300,000 men? The answer was simple. Use those who do not know fear because they do not know life. An entire generation had been raised to worship the Führer. They were obedient, they were fanatical. Most importantly, they were expendable. In June, the High Command signed the order to create a new division. In June 1943, the order became a reality. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was born. 20,000 soldiers, a full stadium of high school students. Most were born in 1926. When the division formed, the majority were 16 or 17 years old. The uniforms hung loose on their narrow shoulders. Faces were covered in teenage acne. They peered out from the hatches of heavy Panther tanks. Their commanders were different. These were veterans from the Eastern Front, hardened, cynical, killers. They were there to turn children into a weapon. How young was this army? 65% of the 1st Battalion were under 18. Only 3% were over 25. The Reich gave them the best it had: heavy armor, anti-tank rockets, MG-42 machine guns. The children received steel instead of diplomas. They were told they were the miracle, the final shield, the ones who would save Germany. The world expected a kindergarten on tracks, but the regime expected a massacre. The final exams for the Hitler Youth graduates began in Normandy on June 7, 1944, one day after the landings. The 12th SS Panzer Division rushed to the front. Steel met flesh near the village of Authie. Canadian troops pushed inland. They expected a retreating enemy. They found a nightmare. The air filled with the screech of shifting gears and the metallic clang of Canadian tank tracks. These teenagers did not hide. They did not wait. British commanders watched as boys sprang at Allied armor like young wolves. No fear, no hesitation, just fanatical aggression. They were effective, terrifyingly so. By the end of the engagement, the division destroyed 28 Canadian tanks. The kindergarten had become a pack of predators. Veteran soldiers noted the difference immediately. Regular German troops fought for a country. These boys fought for a cult. The effectiveness of their indoctrination was written in blood. The fighting stopped. The killing did not. In the village of Authie, fanaticism finally crossed the line into a war crime. Canadian soldiers of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders fought until the last clip. They surrendered according to the rules of war. They expected a prison camp. They found a slaughterhouse. Teenage soldiers did not see opponents. They saw targets. One German truck accelerated. It veered directly into a line of disarmed prisoners. Metal crushed bone. A tank followed, grinding the bodies into the French soil. The killing was not a fluke. It was the policy. Division Commander Kurt Meyer issued a clear directive to his young troops. Do not take prisoners. Retaliate for the bombed cities of the Reich. Mercy was officially rebranded as weakness. The Ardennes Abbey served as the division headquarters. It was a place of stone and prayer. Now it became a killing field. Guards led 20 Canadians into the lush Abbey garden one by one. The soldiers shook hands with their comrades. Then came the shots. Blood soaked into the manicured grass of the garden. The executioners were barely out of school. They killed with the clinical detachment of veterans. At Château d'Audriot, the interrogation was brief. The reconnaissance battalion commander questioned 3 Canadians. They stayed silent. He ordered their immediate execution. 6 more followed. Then a machine gun finished the rest near the chateau walls. 19 murders in one location. This was a calculated system. 156. Only 2 out of thousands who pulled the trigger Only two 15-year-olds faced a judge for executing a prisoner of war. The rest simply went home. When the smoke cleared, judges looked across the bench and saw schoolboys instead of monsters. The legal system hit a wall. Prosecutors had to prove a 15-year-old understood the criminal nature of his orders. In a world of total indoctrination, that proof didn't exist. Every authority figure since the age of 10 had told them murder was a necessity. Every teacher, every commander, every parent. Prosecution became a moral trap. These perpetrators were simultaneously the system's most loyal products and its most tragic victims. Individual guilt dissolved into the machinery of the state. The courts couldn't find the line where the child ended and the soldier began. A mass of killers evaporated into a generation of misguided youths. Justice fell into a void. Only two convicted. By October 1944, Berlin stopped caring about legal nuances. Moral ambiguity evaporated under the weight of a collapsing front. The focus shifted from prosecuting war crimes to a simpler, more brutal task: executing spies. The Reich was suffocating. In the West, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. To the east, Soviet armies crushed entire divisions in weeks. German cities turned into smoldering craters of brick and bone. The leadership saw the end. Their response was a death sentence for an entire generation. They decided to burn the future to buy another week of the present. Every available male, regardless of age, had to fight. A child with a rifle was no longer a student. He was a strategic asset. On the Eastern Front, the air smelled of wet wool and cordite as 10-year-olds waited in the mud. Hitler signed the decree that turned every playground into a recruitment office. The Volkssturm mobilization began. Berlin promised a people's army. Reality delivered a costume ball of death. October 1944, the Reich creates the Volkssturm. On paper, every man from 16 to 60 must fight. In the streets, the age limit vanishes. 10-year-old boys drop their school books to pick up Panzerfausts. Some are so small they cannot reach the trigger. A sergeant has to lift them up so they can aim. 15-year-old Heinz stands in a courtyard in Leipzig. He is not a soldier. He is a child in a dead man's clothes. The SS uniform hangs off his frame. The sleeves swallow his hands. The heavy leather belt wraps around his waist twice. In his grip, the anti-tank launcher feels like an anchor. Training lasts exactly half a day. Heinz learns how to aim, how to fire, and how to die. There is no instruction on how to survive. By October 1944, the law says 16. De facto, the recruiters take anyone who can carry a rifle, even 10-year-old children. They are not reinforcements. They are physical obstacles. Warm bodies meant to delay an Allied tank for 3 minutes, or maybe 5. Through the oversized collar of his tunic, Heinz looks toward the front. In 6 months, these children will burn in the ruins of Berlin. For now, they simply march in boots that don't fit. The boy from Leipzig receives his orders after 5 hours of drill. He boards a truck heading east. He had half a day of training. Those who realized that half a day of training was not enough met their own officers. April 1945. The front line collapsed into a chaotic mess of burning trucks and jagged barricades. What should a child do when he just wants to go home to his mother? The SS answer was absolute: execution. The Nazi regime began devouring its own. Officers removed thousands of underage boys from schools. They sent them on suicide missions to stall the Allied advance for mere minutes. The leadership knew the war was lost. They chose to pay for the delay with children's lives. Margaret Bovary, a Berlin ticket seller, stood near a smoldering barricade. She watched a boy face a firing squad. The air smelled of diesel and wet ash. A sharp burst of automatic fire cut through the screams. He was 14 years old. His crime was desertion. The SS shot him for refusing to die for a ghost empire. The Hitler youth faced a mathematical trap: fight and probably die. Refuse and definitely die. There was no escape and no safe choice. Death came from the front or death came from the back. April 1945. The Reich was a breaking machine. In the East, Soviet steel ground toward Berlin. From the west, American and British armor tore through the Rhine. The Wehrmacht simply ceased to exist as a cohesive force. Tens of thousands of soldiers made a choice. They threw away their rifles. They stripped off their tunics. For most, the goal was simple: reach the Western Allies. Better a cage in the west than a grave in the east. But as the regular army dissolved, another shadow grew. While the veterans surrendered, the children chose a third way. Hundreds of Hitler Youth members remained in the dark. They stayed behind as the front swept over them. Some were cut off during the retreat. Others waited in the ruins by design. They were no longer just boys in short pants. They were ghosts in the enemy's rear. These teenagers slipped through the Allied lines. They hid in cellars. They watched from the shattered windows of abandoned farms. They waited for the moment to strike. The regular war was over. The partisan war was just beginning. They remained behind the lines with a single purpose. Himmler gave these stay-behind units a name that smelled of ancient Germanic myth: Werewolf. By late 1944, the Nazi leadership realized the front was collapsing. They needed a shadow army to breathe down the necks of the victors. The plan was simple: sabotage, assassination, intelligence gathering. The Hitler Youth became the perfect recruitment pool. They were young. They were fanatical. They were ready to vanish into the ruins of their own cities. High-ranking officials saw an advantage in their small stature. A soldier in a field gray tunic is a target. A 12-year-old in a ragged coat is a tragedy. The logic was cynical. Expectation: an innocent child lost in the smoke of defeat. Reality: a trained saboteur with a knife in his sleeve and no rights under the Geneva Convention. But the Allies were not blind. They had captured the manuals. They had interrogated the organizers. Generals knew that the innocent boy wandering near the fuel depot was often drawing a map. International law offered these children no shield. The Geneva Convention protects soldiers in uniform. It does not protect spies in civilian rags. Under the brutal necessity of 1945, the punishment for espionage was not a prison cell. It was a firing squad. The theory of total war became a physical reality in a sandpit near Braunschweig on June 6, 1945. 16-year-old Heinz Petry stood against a wooden stake. He was thin, small, a boy who had celebrated his birthday only 5 months prior. Beside him, 17-year-old Josef Schöner waited for his turn. American soldiers found them hiding in a foxhole behind the lines near Mönchengladbach. They were wearing civilian clothes. Under military law, this was a death sentence. No uniform meant no protection. The military court moved fast. The charge was espionage. The verdict was immediate: execution. Petry was tied to the post. He didn't look like a soldier of the Reich. He looked like a child lost in a man's war. A firing squad of American soldiers took their positions. They raised their rifles. A sharp command. A single, synchronized roar of lead. Dust kicked up from the sand behind the stake. Petry's body slumped against the ropes. 4 minutes passed. An American officer stepped forward. He reached for the boy's wrist. He checked for a pulse to ensure the job was done. The soldiers untied the body and carried it away. Then they brought out Josef Schöner to face the stake. The rifles fell silent, but a question remained without an answer. Were these boys elite saboteurs or just orphans wandering the ruins? We will never know. The military tribunal in Brunswick convened on June 14, 1945. Were they spies? The military court didn't look for nuance. Documents had turned to ash along with the Reich, leaving only the verdicts. These trials operated with the mechanical speed of a frontline assembly line. Defense was a formality. Evidence was often nothing more than a jacket or a pair of boots. American officers looked at the accused. Some wore oversized civilian coats. In a war zone, the lack of a uniform was not a choice. It was a death sentence. Under the rules of the time, a soldier without a patch was a spy. The machinery of retribution did not stop after the surrender. On June 14, 1945, near Rheinberg, the Americans lined up 6 more prisoners. The group included SS personnel caught in plain clothes. They were stripped of their status and their rights. Military justice moved fast to clear the dockets of the dead. Trials and executions continued across the occupation zones throughout the summer of 1945. American judges looked at the code. They did not look into the eyes of the accused. The gavel fell based on ink and paper, not morality. The 1929 Geneva Convention was clear. It set the age of a soldier at 15. Heinz Petry and Josef Schöner had passed that mark. In the eyes of the court, they were no longer children. They were combatants. The law required a uniform. These boys wore civilian clothes while hiding in the woods. This made them spies. For a spy caught behind the lines, the sentence was a single outcome: death. Who was the real killer? The teenager with the rifle, or the adult who put it in his hands? This question remains. The Third Reich had turned an entire generation into a weapon. They taught them that Hitler was a savior. They taught them that death for the Reich was glory. It was systematic indoctrination on a national scale. It was state-sponsored child abuse. But the military tribunal ignored the psychology. They focused on the calendar. The boys were 16. The convention said 15. The execution of Heinz Petry and Josef Schöner was a formal match for international law. While Heinz Petry crumbled into the dust of a quarry, his commander was hiring lawyers. This was the brutal math of post-war justice. Standartenführer Kurt Meyer led the 12th SS Panzer Division. His men didn't just fight, they executed. In the summer of 1944, his soldiers murdered at least 40 Canadian prisoners of war in cold blood. Meyer watched it happen. In December 1945, a court sentenced Meyer to death. But the gallows never came. 1 year later, officials commuted the sentence to life in prison. By 1954, the butcher was a free man. The contrast is a physical blow. A general survives the murder of 40 soldiers. 2 teenagers die for hiding in a hole with a radio. High-ranking officers received appeals, international attention, and legal defense. Children caught behind the lines received a firing squad and a shallow grave. 10 years in a cell for 40 murders. Death for 2 boys in the woods. Kurt Meyer walked out of prison in 1954. Execution in a forest clearing was a mercy. In April 1945, the children of Berlin faced something much worse. Hitler was preparing a meat grinder, and the youth were the raw material. Who was supposed to stop 2.5 million Soviet soldiers? The answer lived in the bunkers of General Helmuth Weidling. The Red Army moved toward the capital with 6,500 tanks. 8,500 aircraft blackened the sky. Against this steel wall, Weidling had 45,000 men. Only 15,000 were actual soldiers. The rest were shadows. Weidling counted his final reserves. He found 1,252 boys from the Hitler Youth and Labor Service. Some were 14, many were younger. The ratio was 1 defender for every 55 Soviet soldiers. It was a statistical suicide. Weidling called the deployment a crime. He saw children with oversized helmets and rifles they could barely lift. Logic dictated a surrender. But logic did not live in the Führer bunker. From beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler issued a final command. He ordered the children to the front lines. Joseph Goebbels knew the truth by March. The maps showed a corpse, but his radio broadcast promised a miracle. He demanded every German stand at the walls of Berlin. He lied to the people. He lied to the children. Who was supposed to stop 2.5 million Soviet soldiers? Goebbels traded the lives of boys for a few more hours of propaganda. He sent them to die for a ghost. The Hitler Youth did not hesitate. They fought with the same fanatical precision seen on the beaches of Normandy. At the Havel Bridge, a single machine gun nest held the line. The boys stayed behind the sights for 48 hours. They watched the horizon. They waited for the steel. The Soviet T-34s appeared, their tracks clattering against the cobblestones. The sound drowned out the children's breathing. One group of 100 boys, attached to a French SS unit, moved through the ruins. They carried Panzerfausts. They didn't retreat. They destroyed 14 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. The indoctrination was total. These children genuinely believed their deaths would turn the tide of the entire war. They fired from shattered windows and rooftops. They stayed until Soviet artillery pounded the brickwork into red dust. Soviet veterans later reported the Hitler Youth were the fiercest defenders in the city. They didn't know how to surrender, they only knew how to die. One Soviet artillery division targeted a narrow sector. They fired until nothing moved. They killed 120 defenders. Most were children. The Soviets claimed the boys waved white flags. They claimed the children lured them in and then opened fire. Perfidy or propaganda, the result was the same. Goebbels demanded a miracle, and the children gave him that miracle at the cost of their lives. The final stand happened at the steps of the Reichstag. 2 members of the Hitler Youth survived the entire battle. General Weidling ordered a surrender from his bunker, but the command never reached the front. On the steps of the Reichstag, the children of the Hitler Youth transformed a military defeat into a slaughterhouse. The Soviets fought for every inch. Room by room, floor by floor, a teenager crouched on a stone balcony, gripping a Panzerfaust. He fired into the courtyard. 1 tank exploded. Then the return fire came. A 122mm shell hit the masonry. Dust swallowed the balcony. Seconds later, only shattered stone and a small gray uniform remained in the rubble. The air inside the Reichstag tasted like pulverized plaster and burnt cordite. Explosions in the narrow stone corridors produced an ear-splitting ring that didn't stop. Grenades fell from the upper galleries. Soviet infantry responded with flamethrowers and submachine guns. Blood splattered the massive Prussian columns. Bodies piled up in the stairwells. Some were sailors, others were SS. Most were boys who should have been in school. They fought with a fanaticism that defied logic. General Helmuth Weidling saw the end and disbanded the formations, but the chaos of Berlin swallowed his messengers. The children kept firing because no one told them to stop. They were buried alive under collapsing ceilings or incinerated in the basements. The casualty rate surpassed the suicide missions of the Pacific. Out of the entire Hitler Youth Brigade assigned to defend the heart of the capital, the final count was absolute. Only 2 survived. Those who weren't buried under the rubble of the Reichstag faced the Soviet infantry face to face. A 12-year-old boy crouches in a cellar. His school uniform is filthy and hangs off his small frame, 2 sizes too large. In his hands is a Panzerfaust. He has had half a day of training. He fires. A Soviet tank erupts in flame. The entire crew dies instantly. What do you do with a child who just incinerated your friends? The Red Army did not come for peace. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people. These soldiers had seen their families murdered and their cities turned to ash. They found the boy in the basement 5 minutes after his kill. Mercy was a lottery. One Soviet officer might see a brainwashed victim. Another saw a partisan who deserved a bullet. Some children were marched toward the camps. Others were lined up against the very walls they tried to defend. The dirty fabric of their oversized jackets soaked up the blood. Captivity was not a guarantee of life. It was a gamble against the rage of men who had nothing left to lose. In the chaos of April and May 1945, nobody filled out forms. No clerk noted the names of the executed children. There are no lists, only the silence of the mass graves. 16-year-old Heinz Petry stood against a wall in Braunschweig. Next to him was Josef Schöner. He was only 17. The date was June 1, 1945. Official surrender had passed weeks ago. The world was celebrating. But for Petry and Schöner, the war ended with a firing squad. The Allied command faced a ghost. They called it Operation Werewolf. It was a Nazi plan for a partisan war behind enemy lines. On paper, it was a terrifying network of underground saboteurs. In reality, it was a desperate fantasy. But the fear was real. Fear kills faster than bullets. Because of this fear, the surrender on May 8th changed nothing for thousands of children. The Allies didn't see orphans. They saw insurgents. Anyone without a uniform was a spy. Anyone with a Hitler Youth knife was a combatant. How do you distinguish a brainwashed child from a cold-blooded killer? The occupation authorities chose mass internment. They herded tens of thousands into camps. The process was brutal. They led the boys into dark cinema halls. The projectors hummed. On the screens, the footage played. Piles of bodies in Belsen, the gas chambers of Auschwitz, the skeletal survivors. The boys watched in silence. Some wept. Others stared at the floor, whispering that it was all Allied propaganda. To mark their status as cleansed, some were forced to wear white armbands. It was a visual brand of defeat. The re-education officers demanded a total psychological break with the past. They stripped away the brown shirts and replaced them with guilt. Most of the children simply stared at the flickering screens, waiting for the lights to come back on. To understand why Heinz Petry was put against a wall, look at Allied intelligence reports. Mid-1945. Allied soldiers had reached the breaking point. They had walked through the gates of Buchenwald. They had buried thousands of their own. Now, they faced a new nightmare, the Werewolf. Intelligence warned of a fanatical guerrilla underground, saboteurs, snipers in short pants. When Allied patrols found teenagers in civilian clothes behind their lines, the logic was cold. No uniform meant no protection. They didn't see children, they saw spies. Military tribunals worked with brutal efficiency. A hearing often lasted 15 to 20 minutes. There was no defense, no long-term investigation. Evidence was secondary to security. Heinz Petry and Josef Schöner stood before such a court. Were they elite saboteurs or just terrified boys hiding in a basement? The tribunal didn't care. The law of the war zone demanded a fast verdict. They were found guilty of espionage. It was battlefield justice, rapid trials, limited evidence, swift executions. Under the legal framework of 1945, these killings were entirely lawful. Legally, the execution of these teenagers was not a crime of passion. It was a cold application of the laws of 1945. Lawyers, not sadists, signed the death warrants. The 1929 Geneva Convention was a relic. It did not account for total war. It did not recognize the mobilization of children as a special case. Under the rules of that era, the minimum age for participation in armed conflict was just 15. Were these executions a war crime? By the standards of 1945, the answer is no. The logic was mechanical. No uniform meant no protection. If a 16-year-old was caught spying in civilian clothes, he was a saboteur. The law did not care about indoctrination. It did not care that these boys had been brainwashed since they were 10. The contrast with the modern world is absolute. Today, the United Nations defines a child soldier as anyone under 18. The 2002 optional protocol strictly prohibits their use in combat. If the Hitler Youth existed now, their recruitment would be a crime against humanity. Modern law treats the child as a victim in need of rehabilitation. But 1945 operated on a different axis. Morality and legality were miles apart. The status of a child in international law shifted from target to victim only decades later. While teenagers face firing squads for wearing civilian jackets, the real executioners walked away. The Western Allies executed a handful of boys for espionage. 2 15-year-olds died for shooting a single prisoner of war. But the mass killers vanished into the crowd. Thousands of soldiers from the 12th SS Panzer Division returned to their homes. These were not just children. They were veterans of massacres. They had murdered prisoners in cold blood. Yet the international community paralyzed itself with a question. How do you judge a child criminal? The legal system faltered. Prosecutors saw the systematic state indoctrination. They saw the age. They saw thousands of potential trials. It was a logistical and moral nightmare. The solution was simple. They released them. The contrast was absolute. Small crimes met a bullet. Mass murder met a pardon. The killers traded their black uniforms for suits. They became teachers. They stood at chalkboards, pointing at maps with the same hands that held Lugers in 1944. They became businessmen and civil servants. Silence became the new law. The shame and the trauma of their service stayed buried. An entire generation of former killers raised families in quiet German suburbs. They carried the weight of a criminal cause without ever speaking its name. The secrets of the 12th SS were kept behind closed doors for 50 years. The silence lasted 50 years. It broke only when historian Michael Cater began asking questions to the gray-haired children of the Reich. He recorded their voices on tape, a thin, rasping sound of old men facing a ghost. Cater and fellow historian Michael Cater peeled back the skin of a hidden national trauma. For decades, these men were just grandfathers. They sat in velvet armchairs. They hugged their grandchildren in sunlit living rooms. But the tapes revealed a different image. June 1944. A 16-year-old in an SS uniform stands over captured Canadians. He pulls the trigger. The shots echo in his memory for a lifetime. He is never prosecuted. The law sees him as a victim of indoctrination, a child soldier. He grows old. He dies peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by family. Contrast this with June 1945. Another 16-year-old huddles in a foxhole behind American lines. He is cold. He is terrified. He is wearing civilian clothes over a scrap of a uniform. The Americans find him. They don't see a child. They see a spy. A military tribunal lasts minutes. The boy is marched to a wooden post. A firing squad levels their rifles. One boy committed a massacre and lived 80 years. The other hid in a hole and was executed at 17. Both were products of the same machine. Both were shaped by the same poison. War does not produce justice. It produces outcomes. In June 1945, the outcome for the boy in the foxhole was a terminal bullet. The history of Heinz, Josef, and thousands of others ends with a single frozen digit. 300,000. That is the number of German children the Reich fed into the furnace. It is the population of a city like Graz or Cardiff, armed with Panzerfausts and sent to die in the mud of 1945. Who answered for these 300,000 broken lives? The archives stay silent. The system killed them twice. First, it stripped their minds with ideology. Then, it lined them up against the wall. By the final months of the war, the Geneva Convention offered no shield. International law failed. 16-year-olds were fair game. Under the brutal logic of total war, executing a teenager became a military necessity. The Allies saw weapons, not children. The Nazis saw tools, not sons. Thousands fell in the rubble of Berlin. Hundreds more met their end before firing squads. Some were shot by the SS for deserting a lost cause. Others were hanged by the Allies for espionage. We will never know the exact toll. The chaos of the collapse burned the ledgers and buried the names. An entire generation was sacrificed by leaders who chose suicide over surrender. They valued the swastika more than the heartbeat of their own youth. Only the lost records remain.